Story 1. Last call from the fire tower. A ranger. His final message. I heard the last transmission from Tower 7 at exactly 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that changed everything I thought I knew about death. The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, a forest ranger with 23 years of experience watching over the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. What he reported in those final 38 seconds before the line went silent still makes my hands shake when I think about it. I was working dispatch that night for the Forest Service, monitoring radio chatter from 12 fire towers spread across 300 square miles of wilderness. August had been dry, the kind of bone dry that turns forests into kindling, and every ranger was on high alert. The air tasted like smoke even inside our climate-controlled facility, and the static from the radio seemed heavier than usual, crackling with an energy that made my skin crawl. Marcus had checked in at midnight like always, his voice calm and professional as he reported clear skies and no signs of fire activity. He was stationed 40 feet above the tree line in a steel tower that had stood for 60 years, watching over a section of old-growth forest that stretched for miles in every direction. Alone up there with nothing but his radio, his logbook, and whatever thoughts keep a man company in the darkness. The first sign something was wrong came at 3:45 a.m. when my radio suddenly burst to life with a sound I had never heard before. Not static, but something that sounded almost like screaming wind, followed by Marcus breathing hard into his microphone. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a tremor that made every dispatcher in the building stop what they were doing. He said he could see a wall of flame moving through the valley below, but it was moving wrong. Fire does not move in straight lines, he said. Fire does not move uphill against the wind. Fire does not burn cold and blue like the thing he was watching consume the forest floor. His voice cracked as he tried to describe what his trained eyes were seeing, something that violated every law of nature he understood. The temperature reading from his station showed 42 degrees, far too cold for any normal fire to sustain itself. Yet Marcus reported flames rising 200 feet into the air, spreading in perfect geometric patterns that formed shapes he could not bring himself to describe over the radio. He said the trees were not burning so much as dissolving, melting away like ice in hot water, leaving behind twisted metal frameworks where wood and bark had been. I tried to raise other towers in the area, but every frequency was dead except for Tower 7. The radio waves themselves seemed to be bending around that section of forest, creating a pocket of communication that existed only between Marcus and our dispatch center. When I attempted to contact the nearest ranger station by phone, I found the lines were down, cut by something that had left clean, surgical marks in the copper wire. Marcus continued his report with the methodical precision of a man trying to make sense of the impossible. He said the fire was not making any sound, no crackling of burning wood or roaring of superheated air. Instead, there was only silence, a complete absence of noise that pressed against his eardrums like physical weight. Even the wind had stopped, leaving the forest in a supernatural calm that made his own breathing sound like thunder. At 3:46 a.m., his voice changed. The professional composure cracked completely as he reported that the fire had reached the base of his tower. But instead of climbing up the steel legs like normal fire would, it began to spiral around the structure in a perfect helix pattern, each revolution bringing it higher with mathematical precision. He could feel the metal getting cold beneath his feet, so cold it burned through his boots and into his skin. The most disturbing part of his transmission was when he described seeing figures in the flames. Not the dancing shadows that fire sometimes creates, but actual human shapes walking through the wall of blue heat without being consumed. He said they moved with purpose, like they were searching for something, and when they looked up at his tower, their faces were faces he recognized from old missing persons reports dating back decades. Marcus had been stationed in that tower long enough to know the local legends. Hikers who had vanished without a trace, hunters who had walked into those woods and never walked out, entire families who had disappeared during camping trips with only their empty tents left behind. The forest had been claiming people for as long as anyone could remember, but the authorities always blamed bears or accidents or simple bad luck. Now Marcus was reporting that he could see them all, dozens of missing people walking through impossible fire, their clothes and skin intact despite the flames that surrounded them. He said they were pointing at his tower, gesturing for him to come down and join them, their mouths moving in words he could not hear but somehow understood. They were calling his name, promising him answers to questions he had carried for 23 years of watching over those woods. At 3:47 a.m., Marcus made his final transmission. His voice was different now, hollow and distant like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. He said the fire had reached his observation deck, but it was not burning him. Instead, it was showing him things, revealing truths about the forest that made his previous understanding seem like childish ignorance. The missing people were not victims, he said. They were guardians, protectors of something ancient that lived in the heart of those mountains. The last thing he said before the line went dead was that he finally understood why the fire moved wrong, why it burned cold, why it chose who it claimed and who it spared. The forest was not burning, he whispered into his microphone. The forest was awakening, and it needed someone to watch over its rebirth from above. Someone who knew every tree and trail, every ridge and valley. Someone who could serve as its eyes in the modern world. The line went silent at 3:47 and 38 seconds. We sent emergency crews to Tower 7 as soon as dawn broke, but they found nothing except twisted metal and a radio still crackling with static. The entire observation post had been reduced to slag, melted in patterns that suggested heat far beyond what any forest fire could generate. Yet the trees around the tower were untouched, their leaves still green and healthy in the morning sunlight. Marcus Webb was officially listed as missing, presumed dead in a flash fire that investigators could never adequately explain. His body was never found, and the cause of the blaze remained classified as unknown origin. The tower was rebuilt within 6 months, equipped with modern digital communication equipment and staffed by a rotation of rangers who never stayed longer than a single season. But every dispatcher who worked that night knows the truth. We know because the new Tower 7 still transmits, usually in the early morning hours when the air is thin and sound carries farther than it should. The voice is different now, distorted by distance and static. But it always gives the same report. Clear skies, no sign of fire activity, and the forest is watching. The survivors of that night, the few campers and hikers who were in the area and lived to tell about it, all report the same thing. They say that sometimes, when the light hits Tower 7 just right, they can see a figure standing in the observation deck. A man in ranger gear, scanning the horizon with binoculars, keeping watch over the forest like he has for decades. Like he always will, and sometimes, late at night when I am alone in dispatch, I swear I can hear Marcus Webb still transmitting on the old frequency. Still reporting what he sees from his tower that exists between the world of the living and something else entirely. Still watching over a forest that claimed him and made him its eternal guardian, broadcasting warnings about fires that burn cold and claim souls instead of trees. Story 2. Shadow of the Shepherd. I never should have taken that detour through Virginia. Never should have stopped at that rotting gas station where the old man warned me about the trail. But I needed to know if the stories were true. If the shadow of the shepherd still walked those ancient mountain paths where 8 people died in 1986. My obsession started 3 weeks ago when I found a police file in my dead uncle's attic. He'd been a state trooper back in the 80s, worked the murders that terrorized the Appalachian Trail. 4 couples, all experienced hikers, found with their tents still perfectly assembled, their supplies untouched, their bodies arranged in a circle like some twisted ritual. The killer left no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing except a single black feather placed in each victim, his mouth. The file contained something the newspapers never mentioned. Each couple had reported seeing the same thing the night before they died. A tall figure in a shepherd, his cloak, standing motionless at the edge of their campsite, holding what looked like a crooked staff. They assumed it was another hiker. They were wrong. I parked my truck at the Grayson Highlands entrance just as dusk painted the mountains purple. The parking lot stood empty except for one rusted sedan with Maryland plates, covered in a thick layer of pine needles. I checked inside, keys still in the ignition, a receipt dated 2 weeks ago on the dashboard. My stomach turned cold, but I grabbed my pack and started hiking anyway. I had to know. The trail felt wrong from the first step. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my boots crushing dead leaves. The trees grew so thick overhead that darkness fell an hour early, forcing me to use my headlamp. That's when I noticed the carvings. Fresh cuts in the bark of every 10th tree, forming symbols I couldn't recognize but that made my skin crawl just looking at them. 3 miles in, I found the first campsite. 2 tents, both zipped shut, both containing sleeping bags that looked slept in. A cold fire pit held the remains of a meal, hot dogs still on sticks, charred black. I called out. No answer. I checked the tents more carefully and found wallets, phones, everything left behind. The phones had no signal, but the last photos showed a couple, smiling, setting up camp. The timestamp read yesterday at 6:47 p.m. I should have turned back. Instead, I kept hiking deeper into the darkness, following those carved symbols like breadcrumbs. The trail narrowed until branches scraped my face and thorns caught my clothes. My headlamp started flickering, though I did just change the batteries. Then I smelled it, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a tomb. The smell led me to a clearing I couldn't find on any map. In the center stood 8 stone markers arranged in a perfect circle, each one carved with a date from 1986. The grass around them grew black and twisted, and the air felt thick, hard to breathe. I approached the stones and saw names etched beneath the dates. The victims, all 8 of them, but there was a 9th stone. Newer, the date read tomorrow. My blood turned to ice water. I stumbled backward, and that was when I saw him. The shadow of the shepherd stood at the tree line, exactly as the witnesses had described. 7 feet tall, draped in a cloak that seemed to absorb light, holding a staff topped with what looked like a human skull. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched me with eyes that glowed pale yellow in the darkness. I ran, crashed through the woods, branches tearing my skin, my pack bouncing wildly. Behind me, I heard footsteps, not running but walking, steady and patient, like he knew I couldn't escape. The carved symbols glowed faintly as I passed them, pulsing like a heartbeat. My headlamp died completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. Do you know how I found the trail again? Adrenaline, luck. Maybe something wanted me to escape to tell this story. I ran for hours until my legs gave out near a creek. I collapsed, gasping, listening for those footsteps. They stopped. When dawn finally broke, I was alone, covered in cuts and bruises, my clothes shredded. I made it back to my truck, but the parking lot had changed. Dozens of cars sat abandoned, all covered in pine needles and dirt like they'd been there for years. The rusted sedan from Maryland was gone. In its place sat a new vehicle, still running, radio playing static. A Missouri license plate, fresh mud on the tires. I drove 15 miles before my phone found signal and immediately called 911. The dispatcher sounded confused when I gave the location. She said that section of trail had been closed since 1987, after the murders. Said nobody was allowed up there anymore. Said they sent someone to check, but her voice suggested she didn't believe me. I pulled over to check the photos I'd taken, but my phone showed nothing. Every picture came out black, except one, the last one. It showed me sleeping in my own bed, taken from outside my bedroom window. The timestamp read tomorrow at 3:33 a.m. I am writing this from a motel 6 states away. I've been driving for 18 hours straight, but I know it doesn't matter. Last night, I woke to find a black feather on my pillow. Tonight, I can smell that sweet, rotting flower scent getting stronger. The TV keeps showing static that forms into those same symbols from the trees. I researched more about the 1986 murders. The investigator who worked the case, Detective Ray Morrison, wrote in his final report that he believed the killer wasn't human. Said he found evidence of similar murders going back 200 years. Always the same pattern. Always the same arrangement of bodies. The department buried his report, called him crazy, forced him into retirement. He killed himself 3 months later. They found him arranged in a circle with 7 mannequins, a black feather in his mouth. The worst part is what I discovered about my uncle. He wasn't just a state trooper. He was Morrison, his partner. The file I found in his attic included photos I wish I'd never seen. Not just crime scene photos, but older ones. Daguerreotypes from the 1800s showing the same circular arrangement of bodies. Cave paintings from indigenous sites depicting a tall figure with a staff, surrounded by 8 smaller figures. And a journal, written in my uncle, this shaking hand, describing how he made a deal with something ancient to stop the killings. The deal required a trade. One bloodline for another. My uncle died 3 weeks ago. The same day I found the file. I understand now. The shadow of the shepherd ISN to his serial killer. It's something much older. Something that feeds on specific bloodlines. Following rules we can comprehend. My uncle broke those rules when he interfered in 1987. The trail didn't close because of the murders. It closed because he trapped a shepherd there, bound it to that place with a promise that his bloodline would stay away. But I went back. I broke the binding. I can hear footsteps in the motel hallway now. Slow, patient, deliberate. The sweet rot smell is overwhelming. The lights are flickering. I am uploading this story to every platform I can find because someone needs to know the truth. Dawn, to go looking for the shadow of the shepherd. Dawn, to research the Virginia murders. And whatever you do, Dawn, to follow the carved symbols if you see them. The footsteps have stopped directly outside my door. There is no shadow under the gap, but I know he is there. The doorknob is turning even though I locked it, chained it, barricaded it with furniture. The black feathers are sliding under the door now, dozens of them, forming a circle around my feet. I see him now, standing in the corner of the room that wasn't there before. He is holding out his hand. In his palm sits a stone marker with tomorrow, this date and my name. But there is something else carved below it. Coordinates. I recognize them. They lead back to the trail, to that circle of stones. The shepherd doesn't to kill you. It makes you walk back willingly. Makes you understand that you were always meant to complete the circle. 8 stones for 8 victims in 1986. The 9th stone was always waiting for the bloodline that interfered. I'm getting in my truck now. I can't control my legs anymore. They re-walking me to the door, to the parking lot, to the highway that leads back to Virginia. I'll be at those coordinates by 3:33 a.m., just like the photo promised. If you find this story, Dawn, to come looking for me. Let the circle close. Let the shepherd sleep. But I know someone will come. Someone always does. The stones are patient. The shepherd is eternal. And there are more empty spaces in that circle than just mine. The trail reopens next month. They say it's safe now. They were wrong. Story 3. Bluefield Specter. The coal dust in my lungs still burns. 3 days after I crawled out of that abandoned mine shaft in Bluefield, West Virginia. But it's not the dust that keeps me awake at night. It's knowing that Thomas Brennan saved my life, and Thomas Brennan has been dead since 1952. I went to Bluefield chasing my missing brother Jake. He'd been sending me strange texts for weeks about finding something incredible in the old Pocahontas mines, something that would make us rich. His last message contained only GPS coordinates and 3 words that made my blood run cold. He just watching me. That was 6 days ago. The drive from Pittsburgh took 4 hours through mountain fog so thick I could barely see the guardrails. Bluefield looked like a town that had died but didn't know it yet. Empty storefronts with broken windows, houses slowly collapsing under kudzu vines, and everywhere that thin coating of coal dust that never washes away. The only motel still operating had one other guest, an old woman who stared at me through her cracked door and whispered something about the Specter before slamming it shut. Jake's truck sat abandoned at the entrance to Pocahontas Mine number 7. The doors hanging open, keys still in the ignition. His phone lay shattered on the driver's seat, screen frozen on a photo that made my hands shake. It showed Jake standing in front of a mine entrance, smiling, but behind him stood a figure in old mining gear, face obscured by darkness except for 2 points of light where eyes should be. I grabbed his flashlight and entered the mine against every instinct screaming at me to run. The entrance had been boarded up decades ago, but someone had torn through the barriers recently. Fresh tool marks scarred the rotting wood. Inside, the temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly, and my breath came out in clouds that seemed to hang in the air too long. The tunnel descended at a sharp angle, supported by wooden beams that groaned with every step. Jake's footprints led deeper into the darkness, joined by dozens of others, some fresh, some that looked impossibly old, preserved in the perpetual dampness. The walls sparkled with traces of coal that seemed to absorb my flashlight beam rather than reflect it. 100 yards in, I found the first body. Not Jake, someone else, wearing modern clothes but covered in so much coal dust he looked like a statue. His eyes were open, staring at nothing, his mouth twisted in a silent scream. His mining helmet sat beside him, the lamp still faintly glowing despite the corroded battery. The helmet had a name etched into it, T. Brennan. My research later would reveal that Thomas Brennan died in the Pocahontas mine collapse of 1952, along with 17 other miners. But unlike the others, Brennan's body was never recovered. Witnesses claimed they saw him in the smoke and chaos, pushing other miners toward safety even as the ceiling came down. They found his helmet near the sealed section, but never him. I kept walking, following Jake's trail deeper. The tunnel split into 3 passages. Jake had marked his path with glow sticks, but they were already fading. I chose the left tunnel and immediately felt the temperature drop again. Ice crystals formed on the walls despite it being late September. My flashlight flickered, and in those seconds of darkness, I heard it, the rhythmic clink of a pickaxe against stone, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber that shouldn't exist according to any mine survey. Mining equipment from different eras lay scattered around, some from the 1950s, some that looked brand new. In the center, I found Jake's backpack, torn open, its contents spread across the ground. His notebook contained frantic writings about finding a new vein of coal, about voices in the walls, about someone warning him to leave. The last entry just repeated one phrase over and over. He is trying to save us all. That is when I saw them, the bodies. Dozens of them, arranged in rows like they were sleeping, all wearing mining gear from different decades. Some looked fresh, others mummified by the cold and dry air. Each one had the same expression of terror frozen on their face. And standing among them, clear as day, was Jake. He stood perfectly still, covered in coal dust, his eyes reflecting my flashlight like a cat. I called his name, but he didn't respond. I approached slowly, reached out to touch him, and my hand passed right through. Not Jake. A reflection in the coal dust hanging in the air, so thick it formed shapes, images, memories of everyone who died down here. The real Jake lay 20 feet away, unconscious but breathing, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. As I rushed to him, the clink of the pickaxe grew louder, urgent. The ceiling began raining small stones. Then I saw him, Thomas Brennan, or what remained of him. He materialized from the coal dust itself, a figure in vintage mining gear, his headlamp cutting through the darkness with impossible brightness. His face was gone, replaced by shadow, except for those two burning points of light. He raised one arm, pointed at the ceiling, then at the tunnel we'd come from. The message was clear. Get out. Now. I dragged Jake toward the entrance as the mine began collapsing behind us. Brennan appeared at every turn, pointing the way when tunnels split, pushing us back when we tried to take shortcuts that I later learned led to flooded shafts. The ghost, the Specter, was saving us, just like he tried to save his crew in 1952. The worst part came when we reached a section I didn't remember, a narrow passage barely wide enough to crawl through. Jake was unconscious, dead weight. My flashlight died completely. In that absolute darkness, I felt hands, impossibly cold, impossibly strong, pulling us forward, inch by inch. I heard whispers in the darkness, 17 voices counting in unison, like they were keeping track of their would-be victims. We emerged just as the main tunnel collapsed entirely, the mountain swallowing the entrance with a roar that shook the whole valley. Jake woke up in the hospital with no memory of the past week. The doctor said he'd been exposed to dangerous levels of methane. Hallucinations were common. But methane doesn't explain the coal dust in his lungs that formed perfect words on the X-ray. Stay away. I went back to check the records. Since 1952, 43 people have entered Pocahontas mine number 7. 41 came out alive, all reporting the same thing. A figure in old mining gear who pushed them, pulled them, or scared them away from danger. The two who didn't make it had ignored the warnings, desperate for coal that fetched premium prices on the black market. But here is what terrifies me most. I found Thomas Brennan, his death certificate, and a photo from 1951. He looked exactly like Jake. Same face, same build, same scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood accident. I dug deeper into our family history and discovered something my parents never told us. Our great-grandfather, his name was Thomas Brennan. He left West Virginia in 1950, changed his name to Brooks, and never spoke about his past. Except Thomas Brennan died in 1952. 2 years after our great-grandfather supposedly left, I called my mother, asked about our family history. She went quiet, then admitted something her father had told her on his deathbed. He had a twin brother who took his place at the mine while he ran away with a married woman. The brother, the real Thomas, died in the collapse, but spent his last moments saving others, paying for his cowardice with heroism. Now I understand why Jake looked familiar to the Specter, why he was drawn to those mines, why Brennan saved us. He wasn't just protecting random strangers. He was protecting his family, the descendants of the brother who he left him to die. Every generation, someone from our bloodline gets pulled back to Bluefield, called by something in our DNA. Our guilt, our debt. I've been having dreams since we escaped. I am standing at the mine entrance in old gear, watching someone approach. Someone who looks like Jake, his future son. Or my daughter. Or another Brooks who doesn't. They really a Brennan. In the dream, I try to warn them, but I have no face, no voice, only these burning eyes and the desperate need to push them away from danger. Last night, the dream changed. Thomas Brennan stood beside me, and behind him, 41 others, all the people he saved. But there was room for more, room for 43, specifically. 2 spaces waiting to be filled. He pointed at me, then at the space beside him, and I understood. Everyone he saves becomes part of his vigil. Everyone he saves owes the same debt. The coal dust in my lungs I ascend to going away. The doctors can, to explain it. It is spreading, forming patterns in my chest that look like mineshaft maps. Jake has it too. We rechanging, becoming something between living and dead, between saved and savior. Soon, I'll have to return to Bluefield, not to enter the mines, but to stand guard at them. Because Thomas Brennan didn't, he just saved our lives. He recruited us, the Bluefield Specter ISN, T1 Ghost. It is all of them, everyone who survived, bound to protect others from the hunger of the mountain. The mine's done, they just want coal. They want bodies, souls, payment for every ton of black rock torn from their depths. And now I hear them calling, all 41 voices, telling me it's time to take my place. Jake hears them too. I'll drive back to Bluefield tomorrow, park at the collapsed entrance to number 7. And wait for the next fool who thinks they can steal from the mountain. Wait to push them back, to save them, to add them to our number. The Specter ISN, Tia warning. It is a recruitment poster. And once you've been saved, you can never really leave. I can feel the coal dust moving in my lungs, forming words. Welcome to the vigil. Story 4, Cursed Book of the Bell Witch. I bought the journal at an estate sale in Nashville for $12. The old woman running the sale said it belonged to her great-great-grandfather, some farmer from Adams, Tennessee. She wanted it gone, wouldn't even look me in the eye when she took my money. Said it gave her nightmares just having it in the house. I should have listened to her. The leather cover was cracked and stained, bound with what looked like hemp rope. Inside, the pages were filled with cramped handwriting and faded brown ink. The first entry was dated September 1817, signed by someone named John Bell Jr. As I flipped through the yellowed pages, certain words jumped out at me. Scratching sounds, cold spots, things moving on their own. A presence that called itself Kate. I am a history professor at Vanderbilt University. I spent 15 years studying Tennessee folklore, and I knew exactly what I was holding. The Bell Witch case is the most documented supernatural incident in American history. Between 1817 and 1821, something terrorized the Bell family farm in Robertson County. It spoke, it moved objects, it physically attacked family members. Even Andrew Jackson investigated the phenomenon and left convinced something evil lived on that land. But this journal wasn't some tourist attraction reproduction. The paper was genuine period parchment. The ink had the rust-brown color that only comes from iron gall compounds used 2 centuries ago. Most importantly, the handwriting matched samples I'd seen in the Tennessee State Archives from other Bell family documents. This was real, an original account from someone who lived through the nightmare. I took the journal back to my apartment in Music Row and started reading that very night. John Bell Jr. wrote about the first incidents in clinical detail, like he was documenting a scientific experiment. Objects disappearing from their usual places. Knocking sounds that seemed to come from inside the walls. His father's health declining for no medical reason. But as the entries progressed, the handwriting became more erratic, desperate. The entity, which the family called Kate after Kate Batts, a local woman who cursed them over a land dispute, grew stronger and more malicious. It could speak, holding conversations with visitors. It knew things about people it should have no way of knowing. It promised to torment the Bell family until they were all dead or driven from their home. The final entries were barely legible, scrawled in what looked like haste or fear. John Jr. wrote about his father, his death, poisoned by some substance that Kate claimed to have administered. The entity, this voice growing louder, more confident. And then, on the last page, a single line that made my blood freeze. He wrote that Kate had promised to return, not to the land, but to anyone who possessed her secrets. I closed the journal and tried to forget about that last entry. Academic curiosity had gotten the better of me before, but this felt different. Wrong. The apartment was too quiet, and every small sound made me jump. The refrigerator cycling on, the building settling, normal sounds that suddenly seemed ominous. I went to bed around midnight, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard scratching sounds from inside the walls. Soft at first, like mice or insects. Then louder, more deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. By morning, I convinced myself it was just suggestion. Reading about supernatural phenomena late at night could play tricks on anyone, just mine. I made coffee, showered, and headed to the university to do more research on the journal's authenticity. The scratching sounds followed me. At first, I thought it was the old radiators in the history building. Then maybe squirrels in the walls. But the sounds were too rhythmic, too purposeful. 3 short scratches, pause. 3 long scratches, pause. 3 short scratches again. Like Morse code, but older, more primitive. I tried to focus on my research, but the temperature in my office kept dropping. Not gradually, like a broken heating system. Suddenly, in waves that made my breath visible in the air. Students complained about the cold when they came to office hours. The maintenance staff checked the HVAC system 3 times and found nothing wrong. That night, I found my kitchen cabinets open when I got home. All of them. Doors hanging wide, contents undisturbed but somehow rearranged. Plates stacked in perfect spirals. Cans organized by weight instead of type. Silverware laid out in patterns that hurt to look at directly. I called the building manager, thinking someone had broken in, but there were no signs of forced entry. The locks were intact. The security system hadn't been triggered. The manager suggested I might have opened the cabinets myself and forgotten. Stress, he said. It happens to professors more than you, do you think? But I knew better. I knew because I read John Bell Jr. as descriptions of the same phenomena. Objects moving without explanation. Impossible arrangements that no human hand could have created. The entity, its way of announcing its presence before the real torment began. The voice started on the 3rd night, just whispers at first, so soft I thought it might be the apartment next door. But the words were too clear, too directed. It knew my name. It knew about the journal. It thanked me for bringing it back into the world after so many years of silence. The whispers came from everywhere and nowhere. The walls, the ceiling, the space between my own thoughts. It spoke in an accent I only heard in linguistic recordings from the early 1800s. Rural Tennessee dialect mixed with something older, darker. Something that had learned to speak by listening to human voices for generations. It called itself Kate, just like in the journal. But this wasn't the spirit of Kate Batts, the woman who supposedly cursed the Bell family. This was something else wearing her name like a mask. Something that had found the perfect way to terrorize God-fearing people in the Bible Belt. Pretend to be the ghost of someone they knew. The physical attacks began a week later. I woke up with scratches on my arms and chest. 3 parallel lines, too deep and precise to be accidental. The marks burned like acid, and no amount of antiseptic could stop the infection that followed. My doctor prescribed antibiotics and suggested I might be scratching myself in my sleep. Anxiety, he said. Maybe I should talk to someone. But I knew these weren't self-inflicted wounds. I knew because they appeared in places I couldn't reach. Between my shoulder blades, on the back of my neck, always 3 parallel lines, like claw marks from something with very specific ideas about symmetry. The journal became my obsession. I read it cover to cover every night, looking for clues about how to stop what I unleashed. John Bell Jr. had tried everything. Prayer, exorcism, moving to different parts of the house. Nothing worked. The entity grew stronger with attention, fed on fear and desperation. But buried in the later entries, I found something the Bell family had never tried. Something that might work if I had the courage to attempt it. John Jr. wrote about a conversation he overheard between Kate and a visiting preacher. The entity had bragged about its power, how it could attach itself to objects and people, moving from host to host across generations. But it also mentioned a limitation. It could only fully manifest in places where it had spilled blood, where it had claimed a life. The Bell Farm was one such place. John Bell Sr., as death had anchored Kate to that land for decades. But if someone could destroy the source of its power, the original anchor point, the entity would be forced back into whatever dark realm it came from. The problem was finding that anchor point. Kate was clever, ancient, and very good at hiding its true nature. But I had an advantage John Bell Jr. never possessed. I had modern technology and 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge about the case. I spent weeks researching property records, genealogical documents, and archaeological surveys of the old Bell Farm. Most of the original structures were gone, plowed under or developed into modern subdivisions. But one building remained, a small stone foundation hidden in the woods behind what used to be the main house. Local historians thought it was a root cellar or smokehouse, but the dimensions were wrong for food storage. Too small, too deep, with drainage channels carved into the floor. The stone was limestone, common in Middle Tennessee, but stained with something that resisted all attempts at chemical analysis. I knew what it was before I arrived at the site. The scratching sounds had intensified as I drove toward Adams, Tennessee. Kate, his voice followed me down the interstate, promising terrible consequences if I continued. But the threats only confirmed what I suspected. This was where it had started, not with the Bell family in 1817, but much earlier. Maybe decades, maybe centuries before. Some dark ritual performed in secret, creating a doorway between worlds that Kate had been using ever since. The foundation was exactly as I imagined it. A circular pit about 8 feet across, carved from solid rock. The stains on the walls were definitely blood, though from what or whom I couldn't tell. At the center, a metal grate covered a hole that seemed to descend forever into the earth. I brought gasoline and matches. Fire was the oldest method of cleansing, and if John Jr.'s theory was correct, burning this place might sever Kate's connection to our world. But as I poured fuel into the pit, the temperature dropped so fast that my breath turned to fog in seconds. Kate's voice rose from the hole like smoke, no longer whispering but screaming in rage and desperation. It promised to follow me anywhere, to destroy everyone I ever loved, to make my life a nightmare that would make the Bell family suffering seem like a pleasant dream. I lit the match anyway. The flames shot up from the pit like a geyser, burning blue and white instead of orange. The screaming grew louder, joined by other voices, dozens of them, all the people Kate had tormented over the centuries. But underneath the screaming, I heard something else. Relief, gratitude, the voices of the dead finally being set free. The fire burned for 3 hours, consuming something more than gasoline and old stone. When it finally died down, the pit was empty, clean. The bloodstains were gone, the carved channels filled with ash that smelled like sage and wildflowers. I drove back to Nashville in complete silence. No scratching sounds, no whispers, no sudden temperature drops. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe normally. The journal was waiting on my kitchen table when I got home. But the pages were blank now, all the brown ink faded to nothing. Just empty parchment bound in cracked leather, harmless as any other antique. I should have thrown it away, but academic curiosity won out again. I donated it to the Tennessee State Museum, where it sits today in their folklore collection. The curators think it is a reproduction, a clever fake designed to fool collectors. They were probably right, but sometimes, late at night when I'm grading papers or preparing lectures, I wonder about the other estate sales happening across the South. All those old journals and diaries and family records being sold to strangers who don't know their true history. Kate might be gone, but there are other entities out there. Other doorways between worlds that clever, ancient things have learned to exploit. And somewhere, in some dusty attic or forgotten storage unit, another curious fool is about to make the same mistake I did. The Bell Witch case officially ended in 1821, but the real story never ends. It just finds new victims, new ways to manifest, new blood to spill in service of powers we barely understand. If you ever find yourself at an estate sale, and some old woman offers you a journal for $12 while refusing to meet your eyes, do yourself a favor. Walk away. Story 5. Norfolk and Western Wreck. I heard the screams 3 seconds before I saw the bodies on the tracks. That is impossible, I know. Sound travels faster than light can process what your eyes are seeing. But I swear to God, those voices came through my radio before my headlights found them standing there in the rain. My name is Marcus Williams, and they'd been running freight trains for Norfolk Southern for 18 years. Before that, it was Norfolk and Western, same rails, same route through the mountains of Virginia and West Virginia. I know every mile of track between Roanoke and Bluefield like the back of my hand. Every curve, every grade, every crossing where drunk teenagers like to test fate against 40,000 tons of rolling steel. But I'd never seen anything like what happened on October 23rd, 2019. The anniversary date should have been my first clue. I was running eastbound with a mixed manifest, 112 cars of grain, containers, and auto parts. Normal run, nothing special except for the weather. Rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the mountainsides into muddy waterfalls and making visibility terrible even with the new LED headlights. The radio crackled with dispatch traffic as I approached the Glenvar grade, about 15 miles west of Roanoke. Other engineers checking in, reporting clear signals and normal conditions. Then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the static cleared and I heard voices that made my blood freeze. Children screaming, women crying, men shouting over the sound of twisting metal and escaping steam. The voices layered over each other like a recording played through broken speakers, distorted but clear enough to understand individual words. Help us, please help us. Why Juan? Did anyone help us? I grabbed the radio handset and called dispatch, asking if they were getting the same transmission. The dispatcher came back confused, said my signal was clear but he wasn't hearing any background noise. Asked if I was having radio trouble. That's when my headlights found them. 40, maybe 50 people standing along the tracks about 300 yards ahead. Men in suits and fedoras. Women in dresses from another era. Children in clothes that looked like something from the 1950s. All of them soaked by the rain, but not moving, not reacting to the 1,000-foot freight train bearing down on them at 60 miles per hour. I hit the emergency brakes and laid on the horn, but stopping that much weight takes over a mile even in perfect conditions. On wet rails, in the mountains, I might as well have been trying to stop the moon. The wheels locked and screamed against the steel, throwing sparks that lit up the mountainside like the 4th of July. The figures on the tracks never moved, never even looked up at the approaching locomotive. They just stood there in the rain, perfectly still, like they were waiting for something. I closed my eyes and braced for impact, knowing I was about to kill dozens of people and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The sound of the brakes was deafening, drowning out everything else until the moment before collision. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. I opened my eyes and found the train stopped, engine maybe 20 feet from where the people had been standing. But the tracks were empty. No bodies, no blood, no sign that anyone had ever been there. Just rain-soaked ballast and shining steel rails disappearing into the darkness. My hands shook as I radioed dispatch to report the emergency stop. They wanted to know if I hit anything, if there were injuries, if I needed medical assistance. I told them I thought I'd seen people on the tracks, but there was no evidence of impact. They logged it as a possible trespasser incident and told me to proceed when ready. I sat there for 10 minutes, scanning the area with my spotlight, looking for any sign of the people I'd seen. Nothing, but as I released the brakes and started moving again, the radio crackled back to life with those same voices. Quieter now, fading like a distant station losing signal. Thank you for stopping, thank you for trying to help us. Back at the yard in Roanoke, I filed my incident report and went home, trying to convince myself I imagined the whole thing. Fatigue, bad weather, too much caffeine. Railroad work plays tricks on your mind after 18 years of night shifts and irregular sleep. But I couldn't shake the image of those people standing motionless in the rain. Their clothes, their posture, the way they seemed to be from a different time entirely. So I did what any reasonable person would do in the internet age. I started researching. What I found in the Norfolk and Western historical archives made my stomach turn. October 23, 1953. The Pocahontas passenger train, eastbound from Bluefield to Norfolk, derailed on the Glenvar grade during a severe rainstorm. 47 dead, dozens more injured. The worst passenger train disaster in Virginia history. The cause was listed as excessive speed on wet rails. The engineer had been running late due to weather delays and was trying to make up time. The locomotive and first 3 cars went off the rails at the same curve where I'd seen the figures. Bodies were thrown hundreds of yards into the valley below. Some were never recovered, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the other reports I found buried in old newspaper archives and railroad union records. Every year since 1953, On October 23rd, engineers running that section of track reported the same phenomena. Voices on the radio, figures on the tracks, emergency stops that saved no one because there was no one to save. The railroad had tried everything to explain it away. Radio interference from military installations, optical illusions caused by headlight reflections, mass hysteria brought on by anniversary stress. They even moved some trains to different schedules, avoiding the midnight run on October 23rd entirely. But the reports never stopped. Year after year, decade after decade, engineers saw the same impossible sight. The passengers of the 1953 Pocahontas, still waiting on the tracks where they died, still hoping someone would stop in time to save them. I should have requested a different assignment the following year, should have taken vacation time or called in sick or transferred to a daytime freight route. Instead, I volunteered for the same run, told myself I needed to prove it was all in my head. That rational explanation would overcome supernatural nonsense. October 23rd, 2020. Same weather, same time, same section of track. This time I was ready. I had a digital camera, a backup radio, even a voice recorder running in case the phantom transmission came through again. I was going to document whatever happened and prove once and for all that dead people don't stand on railroad tracks. The voices started earlier this year, not at the Glenvar grade, but miles back, as soon as I passed the Christiansburg depot. Faint at first, like whispers mixed with static, then clearer, more urgent. They weren't just calling for help anymore. They were giving warnings. Don, come here. Turn back. It's not safe. The rails are wrong. The rails are wrong. I radioed dispatch to check track conditions ahead, but they reported all clear. No maintenance crews, no known hazards, signals showing green all the way to Roanoke. But the voices on my radio were getting more desperate, more insistent. The rails are wrong. The rails are wrong. Look at the rails. I throttled down and activated every spotlight on the locomotive, scanning the track ahead with paranoid intensity. At first, everything looked normal. Standard gauge rails, proper ballast, regulation tie spacing. But as I got closer to the grade, I started to notice subtle differences. The rails seemed narrower than they should be, like they were gradually converging towards some impossible point. The ties were spaced wrong, creating a rhythm that made the train car lurch and sway in ways that defied physics. And the grade itself seemed steeper, more treacherous, like the mountain was reaching up to grab my train and pull it down into the valley. That is when I understood. The 1953 derailment hadn't been caused by excessive speed or wet rails. It had been caused by the track itself. Something was wrong with this section of railroad, something that made crashes inevitable. The company had rebuilt it, reinforced it, upgraded it with modern materials and safety systems. But they built it in the exact same place. The same cursed piece of ground where 47 people had died in screaming terror, thrown from their seats as the cars tumbled down the mountainside like toys. The figures appeared right on schedule, at 11:47 p.m., standing on the tracks in the same spot where I'd seen them the year before. But this time they weren't motionless. This time they were pointing, gesturing frantically at something behind me. I turned and looked back at my train, the 112 cars of freight stretching into the darkness. And that is when I saw what the ghosts were trying to tell me. The cars were tilting, not dramatically, not enough to trigger the derailment sensors, but definitely listing to one side. The same side where the 1953 Pocahontas had gone off the rails. The same side where the valley dropped away into nothing. I hit the emergency brakes for the second time in my career, but this time I knew it might not be enough. The figures on the tracks were screaming now, their voices coming through my radio so loud it hurt my ears. But they weren't screaming in fear. They were screaming instructions. Cut the power, drop the sand, dump the air. Everything you can do to stop this train before it reaches the cursed section of track where the rails go wrong and physics stops working the way it should. The locomotive ground to a halt maybe 50 yards from the figures, close enough that I could see their faces in the headlight beam. Men, women, children, all dressed in clothes from 70 years ago. All staring at me with expressions of profound gratitude, and behind them, stretching back into the rain and darkness, I could see the real railroad tracks. Not the converging nightmare I'd been following, but proper rails with correct spacing and safe engineering. The track my train was actually on, the track that would carry me safely through the mountains to Roanoke. The phantom track faded like a mirage, leaving only the ghostly passengers and the sound of rain on steel. They watched me for a moment longer, then began walking away from the rails, disappearing one by one into the forest until only the echo of their voices remained. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for stopping in time. I radioed dispatch and reported mechanical problems, requesting a relief crew and full track inspection. The maintenance team found nothing wrong with the rails, of course. But they did find something interesting in the locomotive's computer logs. For approximately 30 seconds, just before my emergency stop, the train's navigation system had been following GPS coordinates that didn't match the actual track location. The computer thought we were on a parallel route that would have taken us over a section of track that no longer existed. Track that had been abandoned after the 1953 derailment and never rebuilt. They called it a software glitch. Electromagnetic interference from the storm. Random system error that couldn't be replicated or explained. They upgraded my locomotive's computers and sent me back to work with a clean service record. But I knew better. I knew that some places are so soaked in tragedy that they create their own reality. The ghosts of the 1953 Pocahontas weren't haunting that stretch of track. They were guarding it, stopping other trains from making the same fatal mistake, preventing other families from losing their loved ones to the rails that go wrong. I still run freight through those mountains, but I always slow down when I approach the Glenvar grade. Always listen carefully to my radio on October 23rd road, and sometimes, when the weather is bad and visibility is poor, I hear their voices one more time, whispering warnings about dangerous track ahead, grateful that someone finally stopped in time to save them, even if it was 70 years too late. Story 6. Claw marks on the door. I never believed in monsters until I saw what those claws did to 3 inches of solid oak. The rental listing called it a secluded mountain retreat. What they didn't mention was that the previous tenants had fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind half-eaten meals and blood under their fingernails from scratching at the windows. I found that out later. Much later, my wife Sarah had booked the cabin for our anniversary weekend. 20 years of marriage deserved something special, she said. Something away from the noise of Denver, away from work emails and traffic and neighbors who played music too loud. She wanted silence. She wanted peace. She got something else entirely. The cabin sat 40 miles north of Estes Park, connected to civilization by a single dirt road that wound through pines so thick they blocked out the afternoon sun. No cell service, no internet, just us, the mountains, and whatever lived in those woods. I should have turned around when I saw the door. The cabin looked exactly like the photos online. Log walls, stone chimney, wraparound porch with rocking chairs that faced the forest. Picture perfect, except for the front door. 5 parallel gouges ran from the top of the frame all the way down to the handle. Deep cuts that went through the stain into the raw wood beneath. Sarah noticed them too. She ran her fingers along the scratches, frowning. The grooves were wide enough to fit her thumb inside. Must be from a bear, I said, though something about those marks felt wrong. Too precise, too deliberate. Bears don't usually scratch doors like they trying to solve a puzzle. We carried our bags inside and tried to forget about it. The cabin, this interior was cozy enough. Leather furniture around a stone fireplace, a kitchen with copper pots hanging from hooks, windows that looked out into the endless green of the Colorado Rockies. Sarah opened a bottle of wine while I built a fire. For a few hours, it felt like the perfect getaway. Then the sun went down. The scratching started around midnight. Not on the door this time, but on the walls. Long, deliberate scrapes that circled the cabin like something was testing for weak spots. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, sweeping the beam across the tree line. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound, but I could smell it. A thick, animal musk mixed with something else. Something rotting. Sarah appeared beside me in her pajamas, arms wrapped around herself against the mountain cold. The scratching had stopped, but we could both feel eyes watching us from the darkness beyond the flashlight's reach. Just a raccoon, I whispered, though we both knew raccoons don't smell like death. Back inside, I checked every window, every lock. The scratches on the front door seemed deeper than before, though that had to be the shadows playing tricks. I wedged a chair under the handle anyway. The second night, we found the footprints. They pressed into the soft earth around the cabin's foundation. Massive impressions, easily twice the size of my boot, but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. The heel was too narrow, the toes too long and spread too wide, like fingers instead of digits. Most disturbing were the stride patterns. Whatever made these tracks walked upright on 2 legs, taking steps that measured nearly 4 feet apart. No bear walks like that. No animal I knew of walks like that. Sarah photographed the prints with her camera while I measured them with a tape measure from the cabin, its tool shed. 7 inches across, 11 inches long, pressed so deep into the mud that whatever made them had to weigh at least 300 pounds. We should call someone, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Call who? The nearest ranger station was 30 miles away, and our phones couldn't to get a signal anyway. We were alone up here with something that shouldn't to exist, trapped by our own desire for isolation. The third night changed everything. I woke to Sarah shaking me, her hand clamped over my mouth. In the darkness, I could hear it breathing outside our bedroom window. Slow, deliberate inhalations that fogged the glass. The sound was too deep for a human, too controlled for an animal. We lay frozen as footsteps circled the cabin. The floorboards creaked under us as something heavy moved along the porch, pausing at each window, testing each door. When it reached the front entrance, the scratching began again. But this time, I realized it wasn't too random. The pattern repeated every few seconds. 3 short scratches, then 2 long ones, then 3 short again. Like a code, like communication, like it was trying to tell us something. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that turned my blood to ice. Knocking. 3 deliberate raps on the front door, followed by silence. Then 3 more. Whatever was out there wasn't just an animal. It understood doors. It understood that knocking meant requesting entry. Sarah gripped my arm so tight I could feel her nails breaking skin. We listened as the knocking continued, patient and polite, like a neighbor dropping by for coffee. Then it moved to the back door, then to the windows. Knock, knock, knock at every possible entrance, methodical and thorough. When morning came, we found something that shattered every rational explanation I had constructed. Pressed into the mud beside the deepest footprint was a single human handprint. Small and delicate, with fingernails painted pink, the same shade Sarah wore. But Sarah had been with me all night. She never left the cabin, never walked outside, unless she had another explanation for how her handprint ended up next to those impossible tracks. I stared at her across the breakfast table, studying her face for signs of deception. She looked exactly like my wife of 20 years. Same green eyes, same crooked smile, same scar on her chin from a childhood accident. But something felt different. The way she held her coffee cup, the way she watched me without blinking. We should leave, I said. Why? She asked, tilting her head at an angle that seemed too sharp. We paid for the whole weekend. That afternoon, while Sarah napped, I searched the cabin, its closets and drawers for clues about the previous tenants. Hidden behind a stack of board games, I found a leather journal filled with handwritten entries. The last entry was dated 3 weeks ago, day 12. It just learned to copy us. Yesterday I saw myself standing at the tree line, watching the cabin. But I was inside making lunch. It's getting better at the details. But the eyes are still wrong. Too wide, too hungry. If anyone finds this, don't trust anyone, even if they look exactly like someone you love. My hands shook as I read those words. Behind me, Sarah stirred on the couch, stretching like a cat. When she opened her eyes, they seemed larger than I remembered. Darker, hungrier. What are you reading? She asked, her voice carrying an inflection I had never heard before. I closed the journal and forced a smile. Nothing important, just some old magazine. That evening, I suggested we pack up early. Sarah agreed too quickly, her enthusiasm feeling rehearsed. As we loaded our bags into the car, I caught her staring at the claw marks on the door with something that looked like satisfaction. The dirt road back to the highway seemed longer than I remembered. Every bend revealed more forest, more shadows, more places for things to hide. Sarah sat silently in the passenger seat, humming a tune I didn't recognize. When we finally reached the main road, she turned to me with a smile that showed too many teeth. That was fun, she said. We should come back next year. I agreed because what else could I do? But I've been watching her ever since. Studying the way she moves, the way she sleeps, the way she looks at me when she thinks I'm not paying attention. Everything seems normal, exactly like it should be. Except for her eyes. They be still too wide, too hungry. And sometimes, late at night, I catch her scratching at the bedroom door with her fingernails, testing the wood with the same patient precision I witnessed at that cabin. The claw marks on our door are getting deeper every night. Wildlife officials found no trace of a known animal, they said. But they never looked hard enough. They never thought to check if the animal had already made it inside. I still don't know what happened to my real wife. But whatever came back from those mountains, whatever learned to wear her face and speak with her voice, it is planning something. The scratching patterns have changed. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short again. It is not trying to get out anymore. It is calling something in. And last night, I heard knocking at our front door. 3 deliberate raps, followed by silence. Then 3 more, patient and polite, like a neighbor dropping by for coffee. When I looked through the peephole, I saw myself standing on the porch, smiling with eyes too wide and too hungry. The thing that looks like Sarah let me in without question. Story 7. Smiley Face Hunters. I found the first carved smiley face on a Tuesday morning, 3 miles deep into the Cascade National Forest. The crude symbol grinned at me from the bark of a massive Douglas fir, its mouth stretched too wide, eyes perfectly round and hollow. Something about those empty circles made my stomach turn. I should have left right then. My name is Marcus, and I work for the National Park Service as a search and rescue coordinator. 23 years on the job, and I thought I had seen everything these woods could throw at me. Missing hikers, bear attacks, the occasional drug operation hidden in remote valleys. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered during those 3 weeks in October. It started with Sarah Chen, a 28-year-old graphic designer from Seattle. She had planned a solo camping trip along the Cascade Crest Trail. Her Toyota Camry sat abandoned at the Snoqualmie Pass trailhead for 5 days before anyone reported her missing. When her sister finally called it in, I organized the search team myself. We found her campsite on day 2. Tent still standing, sleeping bag laid out, backpack propped against a tree with all her food and water untouched. Her hiking boots sat neatly by the tent entrance, laces tied. But Sarah was gone. The strange part was the complete absence of tracks leading away from the site. The ground around her tent was soft from recent rain, perfect for holding footprints. Yet there was nothing, not even her own prints returning to camp. That evening, while documenting the scene with my camera, I noticed the carving. The smiley face leered down at me from a pine tree, maybe 10 feet from where Sarah had pitched her tent. Fresh cuts, still weeping sap. Someone had carved it recently, probably within the last few days. I took photos and filed my report, but something nagged at me. The symbol felt familiar, though I could not place where I had seen it before. That night, I went online and searched missing persons cases in national forests. What I found made my blood run cold. Over the past 18 months, 7 people had vanished from national forests across Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. All solo hikers, all experienced outdoors people, all found with their campsites intact and no signs of struggle. And according to amateur investigators on Reddit and other forums, carved smiley faces had been discovered near 5 of the 7 sites. The online community called them the Smiley Face Hunters. Forums buzzed with theories about ritualistic killings, occult practices, and organized groups targeting lone hikers. Most investigators dismissed these theories as internet conspiracy nonsense, but the pattern was undeniable. The symbols were too consistent, the circumstances too similar to ignore. I should have handed the case over to federal authorities and walked away. Instead, I became obsessed. I requested the files from the other missing persons cases, studying every detail, every photograph. The carved faces were identical, same proportions, same crude technique, same hollow stare. Someone was marking their hunting grounds. 3 days later, another hiker went missing. James Morton, a 35-year-old software engineer from Portland, had been backpacking the Timothy Lake Trail. Same pattern, abandoned campsite, no tracks, personal belongings untouched. And carved into an oak tree 30 yards from his tent, another grinning face. This time I was first on scene. I examined the carving closely, running my fingers over the fresh cuts. The person who made this used a fixed blade knife, probably 6 inches long based on the depth and width of the cuts. They took their time, making each curve deliberate and precise. This was not random vandalism. This was a signature. While photographing the symbol, I heard something that made my skin crawl. Laughter, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the trees from somewhere deeper in the forest. High-pitched and gleeful, like children playing a game. But there were no children registered at any of the nearby campsites. I followed the sound for nearly an hour, moving carefully through dense underbrush. The laughter seemed to dance just ahead of me, always out of reach. Eventually it faded, leaving me alone in a grove of ancient cedars where the canopy blocked most of the afternoon light. That was when I saw the others. Carved smiley faces covered nearly every tree in the clearing. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Some looked fresh, others weathered and dark with age. They stared down at me from all directions, an audience of hollow eyes and stretched grins. In the center of the grove stood a circle of stones arranged around a fire pit filled with charred bones. I knew I should call for backup, document everything, follow protocol. But my radio had no signal this deep in the forest, and something primal in my brain screamed at me to run. The faces seemed to watch me as I backed away, their expressions shifting in the moving shadows cast by wind-blown branches. I made it halfway back to the main trail before I realized I was being followed. The footsteps were subtle at first, just the occasional snap of a twig or crunch of leaves behind me. When I stopped to listen, the sound stopped too. When I moved, they resumed. Someone was matching my pace, staying just out of sight. My hand went to the Glock on my hip, but I did not draw it yet. Park Service regulations required extreme caution before displaying a firearm, but every instinct told me I was in immediate danger. The laughter started again, closer this time. Multiple voices, creating a chorus of childlike giggles that echoed from the trees on both sides of the trail. I quickened my pace, no longer caring about stealth or investigation. I just wanted out of those woods. That night I called my supervisor and requested immediate federal assistance. I told him about the carved symbols, the missing hikers, the evidence of cult activity in the national forest. He listened patiently, then informed me that the FBI had been monitoring the situation for months. Agent Sarah Valdez contacted me the next morning. She was part of a joint task force investigating what they officially called coordinated predatory behavior in wilderness areas. Unofficially, they were hunting the Smiley Face Hunters. According to Valdez, the group consisted of at least 12 individuals operating across multiple states. They targeted solo hikers, particularly those camping in remote areas with limited cell coverage. The carved faces served as territorial markers and communication symbols between group members. But the truly disturbing part was their methodology. The victims were not killed in the forest. They were taken alive, transported to secondary locations for what the FBI believed were ritualistic ceremonies. The few pieces of physical evidence suggested the group practiced some form of human sacrifice, though the exact nature of their beliefs remained unclear. Valdez showed me photographs from crime scenes in other states. Bodies discovered in remote caves and abandoned buildings, arranged in ceremonial positions. Strange symbols painted on walls and what appeared to be blood. And always, the carved smiley faces marking the locations where victims were first encountered. She also revealed something that made my stomach drop. The task force had been monitoring communications between suspected group members, intercepted through various digital channels. They knew about Sarah Chen and James Morton before the official missing persons reports were filed. The hunters had been discussing their harvest online, sharing photos and details about their latest acquisitions. But what terrified me most was the final piece of information Valdez shared. The intercepted communications indicated the group was planning something they called the Grand Smile for Halloween night. A coordinated operation across multiple forest locations, targeting what they referred to as the final gathering. I volunteered to serve as bait. The plan was simple in theory. I would return to the forest alone, camping near the grove where I had discovered the carved faces. Federal agents would maintain surveillance from concealed positions, ready to move in when the hunters made contact. We would finally get the evidence needed to shut down their operation and hopefully locate the missing victims. October 31st fell on a Thursday that year. I hiked into the forest that afternoon, carrying standard camping gear and wearing civilian clothes to avoid arousing suspicion. My radio was encrypted and hidden in my sleeping bag. A GPS tracker sewn into my jacket would allow the surveillance team to monitor my location even if I was moved. I set up camp in the same grove where I had found the circle of stones. The carved faces seemed to grin wider in the fading daylight, their hollow eyes following my every movement. As darkness fell, I built a small fire and prepared to wait. The laughter started at 11:37. This time it did not sound like children. The voices were deeper, more guttural, forming words I could not quite understand. They chanted in rhythm, the sound rising and falling like a perverted hymn. My skin crawled as I realized the voices were coming from all directions, surrounding my campsite in a wide circle. I pressed the emergency button on my hidden radio, sending a silent alert to the surveillance team. Then I waited, hand resting on my sidearm, trying to appear calm while my heart hammered against my ribs. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by absolute silence. No wind in the trees, no insects chirping, no distant owl calls. The forest held its breath, waiting for something terrible to begin. They emerged from the darkness like ghosts, moving with unnatural quiet despite the thick underbrush. I counted at least 8 figures, though more shadows shifted between the trees beyond my fire. This light. They wore dark clothing and what appeared to be crude masks carved from wood, each one displaying an exaggerated smiley face. The leader stepped into the firelight, and I bit back a gasp of recognition. Beneath the wooden mask, I caught a glimpse of familiar features. Deputy Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man I had worked alongside for over a decade. Someone I had trusted with my life on countless search and rescue operations. He spoke in a voice I barely recognized, distorted by the mask and something else. Something that suggested years of practice madness. Welcome to the Grand Smile, Marcus. We have been waiting for you to join us. The other figures moved closer, forming a tight circle around my campsite. Each wore an identical wooden mask, but their builds and movements revealed a mix of men and women, young and old. A cross-section of normal people who had chosen to become monsters. Where are Sarah and James? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Where are the others? Bradley tilted his masked head, considering the question. They are smiling now, forever smiling, as you will be soon. The circle began to close, and I drew my weapon. But something was wrong. The GPS tracker felt dead against my chest, and my hidden radio produced only static when I tried to activate it again. The surveillance team should have moved in by now, but I was completely alone. Your friends cannot help you here, Bradley said, somehow reading my thoughts. This place belongs to us now. It has for longer than, As if to prove his point, he gestured toward the trees surrounding us. More carved faces had appeared, dozens of them glowing faintly in the firelight. But these were different from the crude markings I had seen before. These faces moved, their wooden expressions shifting from smile to frown to scream to laugh. And I realized with growing horror that they were not carved into the trees at all. They were nailed there, human faces, preserved somehow, displaying a range of emotions frozen at the moment of death. The missing hikers stared down at me with their final expressions, and every single one of them was smiling. I ran. Protocol be damned. Backup be damned. I turned and sprinted into the dark forest with 8 masked figures in pursuit. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I crashed through the underbrush, using my flashlight to navigate the treacherous terrain. Behind me, the laughter started again, but now I understood what I was hearing. It was not the sound of children playing. It was the recorded screams of victims, somehow altered and looped into a soundtrack of madness that the hunters used to disorient their prey. I ran for what felt like hours, following game trails and creek beds, desperately trying to reach the main trail that would lead me back to civilization. But every path seemed to circle back to clearings filled with carved faces. Every landmark looked wrong in the darkness. Eventually I stopped, gasping for breath beside a massive fallen log. My flashlight was dying, and I could hear my pursuers closing in from multiple directions. That was when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Fresh footprints in the soft earth beside the log. My own footprints, from when I had passed this exact spot 2 hours earlier. I had been running in circles, led by the hunters through a carefully planned route designed to exhaust and confuse their victims. The wooden masks emerged from the shadows around me, their painted smiles reflecting my failing flashlight. I was completely surrounded, with nowhere left to run, but I still had one advantage they did not expect. 23 years of wilderness survival training, and a promise I had made to myself long ago. If I was going to die in these woods, I would take as many of them with me as possible. The fight lasted maybe 3 minutes. I managed to put 2 of them down permanently before something struck the back of my head, and the world went black. I woke up in absolute darkness, lying on cold stone. My hands were bound behind my back with rough rope, and a cloth gag filled my mouth. The air smelled of decay and smoke, suggesting I was underground or in some kind of cave. Gradually, my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering from somewhere ahead. I was in a narrow tunnel, carved from solid rock. Ancient symbols covered the walls, primitive drawings that seemed to writhe and shift in the uncertain light. But among the prehistoric markings, I recognized newer additions. Smiley faces, carved deep into the stone, marking the passage of modern monsters through this ancient place. I worked at the ropes binding my wrists, trying to remember the escape techniques I had learned during my military service decades earlier. The knots were tight but not impossible, and whoever had tied them had not accounted for the fact that my hands were smaller than they appeared. It took nearly an hour to free myself. By then, I could hear sounds echoing from deeper in the tunnel system. Voices chanting, metal striking stone, and underneath it all, a sound that made my soul recoil. Humans screaming, muffled but unmistakably real. I removed the gag and began crawling toward the sounds, using the rough wall to guide me through the darkness. The tunnel sloped gradually downward, leading me deeper underground. The temperature dropped with each passing minute, and my breath began to fog in the cold air. The tunnel eventually opened into a vast underground chamber, illuminated by dozens of torches mounted on the walls. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. The missing hikers hung from wooden crosses arranged in a wide circle around the chamber's center. Some were still alive, moaning softly through their gags. Others had been dead for weeks, their faces locked in those eternal smiles I had seen nailed to the trees above. In the center of the circle, Bradley and his followers performed their ritual. They had removed their masks, revealing faces I recognized from the local community. The bank teller who had processed my mortgage, the mechanic who serviced my truck, the librarian who helped my daughter with her school projects. Normal people, neighbors, friends. They danced around a stone altar where Sarah Chen lay bound and conscious, her eyes wide with terror above her gag. Bradley raised a curved knife above his head, beginning the final phase of whatever sick ceremony they practiced in this underground hell. I should have retreated, should have found a way out and returned with an army of federal agents. But Sarah was still alive, and I could not abandon her to these monsters. I attacked from the shadows, using a loose stone as a weapon. I managed to take down 3 of them before they overwhelmed me, but the distraction gave Sarah a chance to roll off the altar and crawl toward the tunnel entrance. The last thing I remember clearly was Bradley, his face above mine, no longer wearing the friendly expression I had known for so many years. His features had transformed into something inhuman, eyes wide with religious fervor and mouth stretched into a grin that matched his wooden mask. "You will smile for us, Marcus?" In the end, everyone smiles. I woke up in a hospital in Seattle 6 days later. Sarah had managed to escape the cave system and alert authorities, though she remained in psychiatric care, unable or unwilling to describe what she had experienced underground. The federal task force raided the site within hours of her rescue, but they found the chambers empty. No bodies, no evidence, no trace of the cult that had operated there for unknown years. Even the carved symbols had been scraped from the walls, leaving only smooth stone. Bradley and the other conspirators had vanished completely. Their homes stood empty, personal belongings gone, bank accounts closed. It was as if they had never existed at all. The official report classified the incident as an isolated criminal enterprise that had been successfully disrupted. The media coverage focused on Sarah's heroic escape and my role in the rescue operation. The carved smiley faces were dismissed as coincidental vandalism, unrelated to the kidnapping case. But I know the truth. The Smiley Face Hunters are still out there, still marking their territory, still hunting solo travelers in remote wilderness areas. They have simply moved their operation to new forests, new caves, new hunting grounds far from federal surveillance. I retired from the Park Service 3 months after the incident. Now I spend my days monitoring missing persons cases online, tracking patterns, trying to warn potential victims about the danger lurking in our national forests. Because I learned something else in that underground chamber, something the official report could never capture. The symbols carved into those ancient walls were not random primitive art. They were a historical record, documentation of rituals that had taken place in that location for centuries. The Smiley Face Hunters are not a modern phenomenon. They are the latest incarnation of something much older, much more deeply rooted in the dark history of these wild places. And every time I see a news report about another missing hiker, another abandoned campsite, another carved symbol found in the wilderness, I know they have claimed another victim for their eternal collection. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the laughter echoing through my dreams. And I wake up smiling, unable to stop, wondering if I brought something back with me from that underground hell. The faces in my nightmares always look exactly the same. Wide eyes, stretched mouth, perfect circle scars where something sharp has been driven deep into human flesh. They are always smiling. Story 8. Midnight whistle. The train whistle woke me at exactly midnight, screaming through the darkness like a wounded animal. But the tracks behind my house had been dead for 23 years. My name is David, and I moved to Thurmond, West Virginia 6 months ago to start fresh after my divorce. The real estate agent sold me on the quiet mountain town, the cheap rent, the peaceful isolation. She never mentioned the ghost train that would haunt my nights and change everything I believed about death. Thurmond sits along the New River, built around the old Chesapeake and Ohio railway line that once carried coal and timber through the Appalachian Mountains. The town peaked in the early 1900s with over 400 residents. Now maybe 30 people call it home, mostly retirees and folks like me running from something. The abandoned tracks run right behind my rental house, rusted rails disappearing into thick woods on both sides. Weeds grow between the railroad ties, and sections of track have been pulled up entirely over the decades. No train had used this line since the late 80s, when the last coal operation shut down. That first night, I assumed the whistle came from somewhere else. Maybe a distant freight line, or some factory equipment I had not noticed during daylight hours. But when I checked the local maps the next morning, the nearest active railway was over 50 miles away through mountainous terrain. Sound does not carry that far, especially not with the clarity and volume one had heard. The whistle came again the second night. Same time, same piercing shriek that seemed to shake the windows of my small house. This time I was ready. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto my back porch, scanning the old railway line for any sign of movement. Nothing, just empty tracks stretching into darkness, overgrown with brambles and young trees. But the sound had been so close, so real, that I could swear I felt the vibration in my chest. I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, about it the next morning. She was 78 years old and had lived in Thurmond her entire life. When I mentioned the train whistle, her face went pale. She told me about the midnight whistle, a local legend that went back generations. According to the stories, a phantom locomotive appeared on the abandoned tracks whenever someone in town was about to die. The ghost train always announced itself with that terrible whistle at exactly midnight, then vanished before dawn. Mrs. Henderson claimed her grandfather had heard it the night before her grandmother passed away in 1946. Her own father heard it before his brother died in Vietnam. She had heard it herself 3 times over the years, and within a week each time, someone in the community had died. I laughed it off as small-town superstition, the kind of folklore that develops around every abandoned railway line in America. But Mrs. Henderson was not smiling when she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. She told me to pay attention to who else might have heard the whistle. In a town as small as Thurmond, news traveled fast. If others had heard it too, then someone was going to die very soon. That afternoon I walked into town to buy groceries at the only remaining store. The owner, Pete Kowalski, looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes, hands shaking slightly as he rang up my purchases. When I asked if he was feeling all right, he mentioned having trouble sleeping. Something in his expression made me ask if he had heard anything unusual the night before. Pete stopped mid-motion, a can of soup halfway to the bag, and stared at me with genuine fear. He had heard the whistle too. Same time, same volume, same impossible clarity despite the dead tracks. But Pete had lived in Thurmond for 40 years, and he knew exactly what it meant. His voice dropped to a whisper as he told me about the last time he heard the midnight whistle. 3 years ago, just before old Jim Morrison had his heart attack. And the time before that, right before the car accident that killed the Phillips boy on Route 60. Pete was convinced someone in town was about to die, and the ghost train was giving them advance warning. I tried to rationalize it. Small towns are full of elderly residents, so deaths are not uncommon. The human brain looks for patterns even when none exist, and train whistles are such a common sound in rural America that people might imagine hearing them in familiar locations. But that night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for midnight to arrive. Part of me hoped the whistle would not come, that it had been a coincidence or shared delusion. The other part of me needed to hear it again, to prove to myself that something impossible was happening in this forgotten mountain town. Midnight came and went in silence. No whistle, no phantom train, just the normal sounds of wind in the trees and distant traffic on the highway. I started to relax, convincing myself that the whole thing had been my imagination combined with local folklore. Then I heard the rumble, low and distant at first, like thunder rolling across the mountains. But it grew steadily louder, accompanied by the rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails. A train was coming down the abandoned line, moving fast through the darkness toward my house. I jumped out of bed and ran to the back window. The sound was unmistakable now, the deep chuff of a steam locomotive working hard to maintain speed. But the tracks outside remained empty, overgrown and broken, clearly incapable of supporting any kind of train. The whistle shrieked again, so close and loud that I ducked instinctively. The sound seemed to come from directly outside my window, as if a massive locomotive was passing just feet from my house. But there was nothing there, just empty air above the rusted rails. Then I saw the light. A single bright beam cut through the darkness, sweeping back and forth like a searchlight. It moved along the path of the old railway, illuminating sections of track and forest as it passed. But the light had no source. No locomotive, no lantern, just a floating beam that followed the railway line through the night. The sound and light moved past my house and continued west, fading gradually into the distance. Within minutes, the forest returned to normal silence, leaving me standing at my window wondering if I had lost my mind. I called in sick the next morning and drove to the local library in nearby Hinton. If the midnight whistle was a real phenomenon, there had to be some historical record of it. Local newspapers, accident reports, something that would explain the legend. What I found in the archived newspapers made my blood run cold. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway had indeed suffered multiple fatal accidents along the Thurmond line over the decades. But the details were far more disturbing than simple derailments or mechanical failures. In 1928, a passenger train had crashed during a late-night run, killing 17 people. The official cause was listed as engineer error, but witness statements mentioned strange lights on the tracks ahead of the train, as if another locomotive was approaching head-on. The engineer had applied emergency brakes and blown the whistle repeatedly before impact, but no second train was ever found. 1934 brought another disaster. A freight train carrying coal derailed at high speed, crushing the entire crew of 4 men. Again, witnesses reported seeing lights on the tracks before the accident, and the engineer had been blowing his whistle in apparent warning to something ahead. The pattern continued through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Fatal accidents every few years, always preceded by reports of phantom lights and mysterious whistle blasts echoing through the mountains. By the time the railway finally shut down in 1987, over 60 people had died on the Thurmond line under suspicious circumstances. But the most chilling discovery came in the local death records. Every single one of those train accidents had occurred within 1 week of someone dying in the town of Thurmond itself. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents, murders. The ghost train did not cause the deaths. It announced them. I spent the rest of that day researching every aspect of the legend, cross-referencing newspaper reports with death certificates and cemetery records. The correlation was undeniable. For over a century, the phantom locomotive had appeared whenever death was coming to the small mountain community. And, according to every account I could find, the ghost train never made a mistake. That evening I returned home with a new understanding of what I had witnessed. The midnight whistle was not just folklore. It was a genuine supernatural phenomenon with a documented history going back generations. And if the pattern held true, someone in Thurmond was going to die within the next few days. I tried to call Mrs. Henderson to check on her, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Pete's store was closed when I drove by, with no explanation posted on the door. A creeping sense of dread settled over me as I realized I might be witnessing the beginning of the next cycle. The whistle came again that night, but this time it sounded different. More urgent, more desperate, as if the phantom engineer was trying to deliver a specific warning. I stood on my back porch listening to the impossible sound, watching that floating light sweep along the abandoned tracks. As the ghost train passed my house, I noticed something I had missed before. The light was not moving randomly. It was focused, deliberately illuminating specific sections of the railway line. And in those brief moments of illumination, I could see something that made my stomach turn. Figures standing on the tracks. Dozens of them, lined up along the rails like passengers waiting for a train. But they were not solid. They flickered and wavered like heat mirages, there 1 second and gone the next. The dead were gathering. All the victims of the various train accidents over the decades, still tied to the railway line that had claimed their lives. And they were waiting for someone new to join them. I spent the next day driving around Thurmond, checking on every resident I could find. Mrs. Henderson was fine, tending her garden and asking if I had heard any more whistles. Pete had reopened his store, though he still looked tired and nervous. The other residents I encountered seemed healthy and normal, but there was one person I could not locate. Sarah Martinez, a woman in her 50s who lived alone in a trailer on the outskirts of town. Her neighbors had not seen her for 3 days, and her car sat in the driveway covered with leaves. I convinced Pete to come with me to check on her. We found Sarah collapsed in her kitchen, barely conscious and burning with fever. An ambulance rushed her to the hospital in Charleston, where doctors diagnosed severe pneumonia that had nearly killed her. Sarah survived, recovering fully after a week of intensive treatment. And for the first time since I had moved to Thurmond, the midnight whistle did not blow at midnight. I thought the crisis had passed. The ghost train had delivered its warning, medical intervention had prevented the predicted death, and the supernatural cycle had been broken. But I was wrong about how the phenomenon actually worked. The whistle returned 2 weeks later, louder and more insistent than ever before. This time the phantom light lingered longer, sweeping back and forth across the same section of track near my house. The ghostly figures I had glimpsed before were more numerous now, crowding the rails as if anticipating something momentous. I knew with absolute certainty that someone was going to die that night, and there was nothing I could do to prevent it. The call came at 3 a.m. Pete, his voice shaking with grief and shock. Mrs. Henderson had passed away in her sleep, peacefully and without warning. Her heart had simply stopped beating sometime after midnight. At the funeral, the older residents of Thurmond shared their memories of Mrs. Henderson and their experiences with the midnight whistle. Every family in town had stories going back generations. The ghost train was as much a part of their community as the post office or the general store. But I learned something else that day that changed my entire understanding of the phenomenon. Mrs. Henderson had not just heard the whistle over the years. She had seen the ghost train itself, complete with passenger cars and a crew of spectral figures. According to her nephew, she had always claimed that the phantom locomotive was not there to take souls away. It was there to guide them safely to whatever came next. The whistle was not a harbinger of doom, but a final call for boarding. And Mrs. Henderson had been ready for that last journey. I stayed in Thurmond for another month after the funeral, but the midnight whistle did not return. The town settled into its normal quiet rhythm, and life continued as it had for over a century. When I finally decided to move back to the city, Pete helped me load my belongings into the rental truck. As we finished, he pulled me aside and shared one final piece of local wisdom. He told me that everyone who stays in Thurmond long enough eventually hears their own whistle. Not the general warning that announces death in the community, but a personal call meant specifically for them. When that happens, they have a choice. They can fight it, run from it, deny it, or they can accept it and find peace. Mrs. Henderson had made her choice years ago. When her personal whistle finally came, she was ready. I moved back to Cincinnati and tried to put the whole experience behind me. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear that distant whistle calling across the years and miles. And I wonder if the ghost train follows certain people, marking them for future collection regardless of where they go. Because the thing about the midnight whistle is that once you hear it, really hear it, you become part of its story. You join the long list of people connected to that phantom locomotive and its supernatural mission. I am 42 years old now, and statistically I have decades left to live. But every night at midnight, I listen for that familiar whistle. And I know that someday, probably when I am old and tired and ready for whatever comes next, I will hear it calling specifically for me. The ghost train of the Chesapeake in Ohio is patient. It has been making its rounds for over a century, and it will continue long after everyone alive today has boarded for that final journey. The only question is whether you will be ready when your whistle blows. I hope I will be. Because fighting the inevitable is exhausting, and there is something oddly comforting about knowing that when my time comes, I will not have to face it alone. The phantom engineer will be there, lantern held high, ready to guide me safely through the darkness to whatever station awaits on the other side. Sometimes I even catch myself looking forward to that last ride through the mountains. Wheels clacking on celestial rails, whistle echoing across dimensions as we carry the dead toward their final destination. Until then, I listen. And I wait. And I remember the lesson Mrs. Henderson taught me without ever saying a word. Death is not the end of the journey. It is just the moment when we finally hear our own whistle calling us home. Story 9. Watcher on the ridge. The red eyes watched me from the mountain ridge for 3 nights before my daughter died. I am telling you this because what happened to me in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia changed everything I believed about the world. My name is Tom Russell, and I am a 41-year-old insurance adjuster from Richmond. I lived a normal life until last October, when I encountered something that should not exist. It started with a simple assignment. A cabin fire near Shenandoah National Park had resulted in a substantial claim, and my company needed someone to investigate the scene. The property sat on 20 isolated acres, accessible only by a narrow gravel road that wound through dense forest for nearly 5 miles. I arrived at the burned cabin on a Thursday afternoon in late October. The structure had been completely destroyed, leaving only a stone foundation and a twisted metal chimney pointing toward the gray sky. According to the fire report, the blaze had started around midnight 3 weeks earlier, and the volunteer fire department had been unable to save anything. The property owner, an elderly man named Jacob Mills, had been visiting family in Tennessee when the fire occurred. He claimed to have no enemies and no knowledge of how the fire might have started. The local fire marshal suspected electrical problems, but the complete destruction of the cabin made determining the exact cause nearly impossible. I spent several hours documenting the scene, taking photographs and measurements for my report. The cabin had been built in the 1950s and showed signs of outdated wiring, which supported the electrical fire theory. But something about the burn pattern bothered me. The damage seemed too complete, too systematic, as if the fire had burned unusually hot for an accidental blaze. As evening approached, I decided to drive back to my motel in nearby Waynesboro rather than risk the mountain roads in darkness. But as I walked toward my car, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The feeling was so strong that I stopped and scanned the surrounding forest, looking for any sign of another person. That was when I saw it for the first time. On the ridge overlooking the burned cabin, perhaps 200 yards away, stood a figure unlike anything I had ever seen. It appeared to be roughly human in shape, but much larger, at least 7 feet tall with an impossibly broad wingspan. Even at that distance, I could see the red glow of its eyes, twin points of crimson light that seemed to bore directly into my soul. The creature stood motionless on the rocky outcrop, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Its wings were not like a bird's, but more like a bat's, with a leathery membrane stretched between elongated finger bones. Its body seemed hunched and powerful, with disproportionately long arms that hung at its sides. I fumbled for my camera, but by the time I managed to focus on the ridge, the creature had vanished. Only empty rock and skeletal trees remained against the twilight. I convinced myself that I had seen a large bird, perhaps a turkey vulture or even a black bear standing on its hind legs. The red eyes must have been a trick of the fading light, reflecting off water or glass somewhere in the forest. But I could not shake the feeling that something had been studying me with predatory intelligence. I drove back to the motel that night trying to rationalize what I had witnessed. The mountains were full of wildlife, and the isolation could play tricks on your mind. I had been working too many hours lately, and the stress of my recent divorce was affecting my judgment. There had to be a logical explanation for what I thought I had seen. The next morning I returned to the cabin site to complete my investigation. I needed to interview the nearest neighbors and document the surrounding area for my report. According to the county records, the closest occupied property was about 2 miles down the mountain, owned by a family named Patterson. I found the Patterson house at the end of a dirt driveway marked by a rusty mailbox. It was a modest ranch-style home surrounded by several acres of pasture land. A few horses grazed in a fenced paddock, and the property had the well-maintained look of people who took pride in their land. Eleanor Patterson answered the door when I knocked. She was a woman in her 70s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take my measure immediately. When I explained my purpose and asked about the cabin fire, her expression grew troubled. She invited me inside and served coffee while we talked. Eleanor had lived in the mountains for over 50 years and knew the history of every property in the area. The Mills cabin had always been associated with strange occurrences, she told me. Previous owners had reported unusual animal behavior, electronic equipment malfunctioning, and an overall sense of unease that seemed to permeate the property. But it was when I mentioned seeing a large bird or animal on the ridge that Eleanor's face went pale. She set down her coffee cup and stared at me with genuine fear. She told me about the Watcher, a creature that had haunted the Blue Ridge Mountains for generations. Local Cherokee legend spoke of a winged guardian that protected the mountains from intruders. Early European settlers had reported encounters with a massive flying creature that stalked travelers on remote mountain roads. According to Eleanor, the Watcher appeared to people who were about to experience significant tragedy in their lives. It did not cause the misfortune, but somehow sensed it coming and made itself known to those who were marked for suffering. Her own grandfather had seen the creature 3 days before his youngest son died in a hunting accident in 1942. Her cousin had spotted it perched on his barn roof a week before his wife died in childbirth. Eleanor herself had glimpsed the red eyes watching from the forest the night before her husband suffered the heart attack that killed him 15 years earlier. I thanked Eleanor for the information and tried to maintain professional skepticism, but her sincerity was unsettling. She genuinely believed in the creature she described, and her fears seemed based on personal experience rather than folklore. That evening, I called my ex-wife Michelle to check on our daughter Emma. The divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, and I was still adjusting to the limited visitation schedule. Emma was only 8 years old, and the separation had been difficult for her. Michelle told me that Emma had been feeling sick for the past few days. Nothing serious, just a low-grade fever and fatigue that seemed like a minor virus. They had a doctor's appointment scheduled for Monday if she did not improve over the weekend. I made plans to cut my investigation short and drive back to Richmond the next day. Something about my conversation with Eleanor Patterson had left me deeply uneasy, and I wanted to be closer to my daughter. But first, I needed one more look at the cabin site to complete my documentation. I arrived early Saturday morning, hoping to finish quickly and begin the drive home. The October weather had turned cold overnight, and frost covered the burned foundation like a crystal shroud. As I worked, I kept glancing toward the ridge where I had seen the creature 2 days earlier. The rocky outcrop remained empty in the morning light, but I could not shake the feeling of being observed. Every few minutes I would stop what I was doing and scan the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. It was during one of these paranoid surveys that I noticed something I had missed before. On the side of the ridge facing the cabin, carved into a large boulder, was a series of symbols that definitely were not natural. The markings appeared to be Native American in origin, weathered by decades of exposure but still clearly visible. I climbed up to examine the petroglyphs more closely. The symbols depicted winged creatures, human figures, and what appeared to be representations of death or disaster. At the center of the arrangement was a larger carving that unmistakably showed a humanoid figure with outstretched wings and prominent eyes. The watcher had been known to this area for a very long time. As I photographed the rock carvings, my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Michelle's number, but when I answered, I heard Emma's voice instead. She sounded weak and scared, telling me that she felt really sick and wanted me to come home. The call lasted only a few seconds before the line went dead. When I tried to call back, I got no signal. The mountains were notorious for poor cell coverage, but the timing felt ominous. I packed my equipment as quickly as possible and began the drive back toward civilization. But as I navigated the winding mountain road, I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Dark shapes seemed to pace my car through the forest, staying just out of clear sight. Then I saw it directly ahead of me. The creature stood in the middle of the narrow road, blocking my path completely. In daylight, it was even more terrifying than my glimpse from the ridge had suggested. It stood nearly 8 feet tall on powerful legs that ended in clawed feet. Its wingspan was enormous, at least 15 feet from tip to tip. The leathery wings were folded against its body, but I could see the intricate pattern of veins and the sharp talons at the wing joints. But it was the face that made my blood freeze. The creature possessed distinctly human features, but distorted and elongated. Its skin was dark gray, almost black, with a texture that looked like leather or bark. The red eyes that had watched me from the ridge now blazed like coals, and a skull-like face dominated by a mouth full of sharp teeth. The watcher stared at me through the windshield with ancient intelligence and something that might have been pity. It did not move to attack or threaten me directly. Instead, it simply stood there as if delivering a silent message that I was not equipped to understand. I sat paralyzed behind the steering wheel for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The creature never blinked, never shifted position, never gave any indication that it intended to move aside. Finally, I managed to reach for my camera to document this impossible encounter. The moment I raised the camera, the watcher spread its massive wings and leapt into the air. The sound of its wing beats was like thunder rolling through the mountains. It circled my car once, close enough that I could see the individual feathers on its wing membranes, then disappeared over the tree line. I drove home in a state of shock, my mind racing to process what I had experienced. The logical part of my brain insisted that I had hallucinated the entire encounter due to stress and suggestion. But the primal part of me knew with absolute certainty that I had met something beyond human understanding, and that it had been trying to warn me about Emma. I arrived in Richmond late that evening and went straight to Michelle's house. Emma was in the hospital. What had seemed like a simple virus that morning had suddenly turned into something much more serious. High fever, difficulty breathing, symptoms that baffled the emergency room doctors. The next 3 days passed in a blur of hospital corridors, medical tests, and growing desperation as Emma's condition continued to deteriorate. The doctors ran every test they could think of, but they could not identify the cause of her illness or find an effective treatment. On the fourth night, as I sat beside her hospital bed watching her struggle to breathe, Emma opened her eyes and looked directly at me. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words cut through me like a blade. She told me about the dreams she had been having. Dreams of flying over mountains and forests, carried by something with huge wings and red eyes. In the dreams, the creature was not frightening but protective, like a guardian angel watching over her. Emma died the next morning. The official cause was listed as viral encephalitis of unknown origin, a rare condition that strikes healthy children without warning and claims their lives before anyone can react. But I knew the truth. The Watcher had tried to warn me that tragedy was coming. It had shown itself to me repeatedly, attempting to communicate that my daughter was in danger. And I had been too skeptical, too rational, too blind to understand. I returned to the Blue Ridge Mountains 3 weeks after Emma's funeral. I needed to see the place where the nightmare had begun, to try to make sense of what had happened. The burned cabin site looked exactly the same, but now I understood why fires and accidents seemed to occur there regularly. The Watcher used this location as a vantage point to observe the human world below. It was drawn to places where tragedy would unfold, appearing to those who were about to lose everything they held dear. I climbed up to the ridge where I had first seen the creature, following a barely visible trail through the thick forest. Near the top, I found what I was looking for, a cave opening, partially concealed by fallen rocks and overgrown vegetation. Inside, the walls were covered with hundreds of petroglyphs depicting the Watcher and the people it had observed over the centuries. Images of death and disaster, families torn apart by tragedy, communities destroyed by forces beyond their control. But among the darker images were others that suggested a different interpretation. The Watcher was not a harbinger of doom, but a witness to the unavoidable suffering that defines human existence. It appeared to people who were about to experience loss because it understood their pain and wanted them to know they were not alone. At the back of the cave, carved into the stone wall, was a fresh petroglyph that had not been there when ancient hands created the others. It showed a man standing beside a small figure, both watched over by the winged creature with blazing eyes. The Watcher had added Emma and me to its eternal gallery of human sorrow. I left the mountains that day with a new understanding of my encounter with the creature. It had not been trying to frighten me or predict Emma's death. It had been offering comfort, letting me know that even in my darkest hour, something ancient and wise was aware of my suffering. The Cherokee were right to call it a guardian, not a protector that could prevent tragedy, but a witness that ensured no one had to face their worst moments completely alone. 6 months have passed since Emma died, and I have not seen the Watcher again. But sometimes, late at night, I think I catch a glimpse of red eyes reflected in my bedroom window. Not threatening or ominous, but watching over me with the patience of something that has witnessed human grief for centuries. I know now that the Watcher appears to people who are about to lose what matters most to them. But I also know that it stays with them afterward, a constant reminder that even the deepest sorrow is shared by something greater than ourselves. The mountains of Virginia still hide this ancient guardian, still shelter the creature that serves as witness to our most profound losses. And someday, when tragedy strikes another family in these remote hills, the Watcher will make itself known again. Because that is what guardians do. They watch, they witness, they ensure that no one suffers alone in the darkness. The red eyes are always there, just beyond the edge of vision, reminding us that we are seen, we are known, and we are not forgotten. Story 10. Screams of Pennhurst. The screams started at 3:17 in the morning, and they were coming from inside the walls of Pennhurst Asylum. My name is Jake Morrison, and I am a paranormal investigator with 15 years of experience exploring haunted locations across America. I have spent nights in hundreds of supposedly haunted places, from Civil War battlefields to abandoned prisons. But nothing prepared me for what I encountered in the crumbling corridors of Pennsylvania, this most notorious mental institution. Pennhurst State School and Hospital operated from 1908 to 1987, housing thousands of patients with developmental disabilities in conditions that can only be described as medieval. The facility became synonymous with abuse, neglect, and human suffering on an industrial scale. Patients were beaten, starved, left naked in their own filth, and subjected to medical experiments that violated every principle of human dignity. A 1968 television expose revealed the horrific reality inside Penhurst, showing emaciated patients tied to beds, children covered in their own waste, and staff using violence as routine crowd control. The public outcry eventually led to the facility disclosure, but not before decades of torture had soaked into the very foundations of the buildings. I had been planning a solo investigation at Penhurst for months, waiting for the right opportunity to gain access to the restricted sections of the complex. Most paranormal teams only get permission to visit the sanitized areas open to public tours. But I had connections with the property management company that allowed me to explore the entire facility during off hours. I arrived at the Penhurst campus on a cold October evening, driving through the main gates just as the last tour group was leaving. The complex sprawled across nearly 1,400 acres, with over 60 buildings in various states of decay. Most of the structures had been abandoned for decades, their windows broken, roofs collapsed, and interiors reclaimed by nature. But it was the Mayflower building that drew me like a magnet. This particular structure had housed the most severely disabled patients, the ones deemed too damaged or dangerous for the general population. The building had been sealed since the early 1990s due to structural concerns, making it largely unexplored by other investigators. I set up my equipment in what had once been the main ward of the Mayflower building. Digital audio recorders, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and temperature sensors formed a web of surveillance throughout the long corridor lined with patient rooms. The institutional green paint peeled from the walls in long strips, and the floor was littered with debris from decades of neglect. The first few hours passed quietly. I documented the building, its layout, took photographs of the patient rooms, and recorded baseline readings from my instruments. Many of the rooms still contained remnants of their former occupants, rusted bed frames, torn restraints, and medical equipment that looked more like torture devices than therapeutic tools. But it was in room 23 that I found something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the wall above what had once been a patient, its bed were dozens of tally marks. Someone had been counting days, months, maybe years of confinement in this hellish place. But among the hash marks were words, carved deep into the plaster with desperate fingers or stolen implements. "Help me. Make it stop. Please God, let me die." The final message was the most disturbing. "I want to go home," written in shaky letters that suggested the author's deteriorating mental state. Below it was a signature. Billy K., age 12. A 12-year-old child had carved his pleas for freedom into the wall of this room, probably spending years waiting for rescue that never came. The thought of what Billy K. had endured in this place made me physically sick. I was photographing the wall carvings when my audio equipment detected the first anomaly. A low humming sound, barely audible but clearly artificial. It seemed to emanate from the heating system, though the building had no power and the old radiators had been cold for decades. The humming grew louder over the next hour, eventually resolving into what sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison. The words were indistinct, muffled by distance or interference, but the tone was unmistakably distressed. I followed the sound through the maze of corridors, my digital recorder capturing every whispered syllable. The voices led me to the basement level, where the building's most disturbing secrets had been hidden from public view. This was where the worst abuses had taken place, where patients deemed incurable had been warehoused and forgotten. The basement rooms had no windows, no ventilation, and no hope of rescue for the souls trapped within. It was here that I first heard the screams. They started as distant echoes, like the sound of voices calling from the bottom of a deep well. But as I moved deeper into the basement, the screams grew more distinct, more human, more filled with the kind of terror that only comes from genuine torment. The sounds were not random. They followed a pattern, building to crescendos of anguish before fading to whispered sobs. I realized I was hearing the audio residue of decades of abuse, somehow imprinted on the building itself like a ghostly recording that played on an endless loop. My electromagnetic field detectors began registering massive spikes, their alarms piercing the darkness as invisible presences moved through the corridors around me. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a matter of minutes, and my breath formed clouds in the suddenly frigid air. But it was the voices that truly terrified me. Not screams now, but clear, distinct pleas for help. Different voices, different ages, all begging for rescue from their endless nightmare. "Please help me. I want my mother. Make them stop hurting me." I did not do anything wrong. The voices overlapped and intertwined, creating a chorus of desperation that seemed to pour from the very walls of the building. I recognized some of the speech patterns as consistent with developmental disabilities, the halting words and simple phrases of minds that had never fully matured. These were the voices of Penhurst's victims, somehow preserved in the place where they had suffered and died. The building itself had become a repository for their pain, playing back their final pleas across the decades. I followed the sounds to a room at the end of the basement corridor. The heavy metal door stood ajar, revealing an interior that defied description. The walls were covered in scratch marks, deep gouges that could only have been made by human fingernails. The floor was stained with substances I did not want to identify. But it was the corner of the room that made me understand the true horror of what had happened here. Embedded in the concrete wall were metal rings, the kind used to secure restraints. Below them, the wall was worn smooth by decades of human contact, polished by the desperate struggles of patients chained in this forgotten hell. The voices were loudest here, a cacophony of pain that seemed to emanate from the very stones. I could distinguish individual speakers now. A young girl calling for her mother, an elderly man begging to be released, a teenager promising to be good if only someone would help him. And underneath it all, a voice I recognized from the carved message upstairs. Billy Kay, still 12 years old, still asking to go home after decades of death. I set up my most sensitive recording equipment in that terrible room, determined to capture evidence of what I was experiencing. But as I adjusted the settings on my digital recorder, something touched my shoulder. I spun around to find the room empty, but the sensation had been unmistakable. A human hand, small and cold, had reached out in the darkness to make contact with the living world. The temperature plummeted another 15 degrees, and my breath now formed thick clouds that obscured my vision. Ice crystals began forming on the walls, and the metal rings in the corners started to rattle as if invisible hands were pulling at long-vanished restraints. The voices grew more urgent, more demanding. They were no longer just replaying past suffering but actively trying to communicate with me. The dead patients of Penhurst wanted something, needed something, and they were using every ounce of residual energy to make themselves known. That was when I heard my name. Jake Morrison. Help us, Jake. The voice was clear and distinct, speaking with an intelligence that suggested awareness of my presence. Somehow, the spirits trapped in this place knew who I was and why I had come. They saw me as their potential savior, the one person who might finally tell their story to the world. But as I tried to respond, to let them know I was listening, the building itself seemed to rebel against my presence. Doors slammed shut throughout the basement, the sound echoing through the corridors like gunshots. My equipment began malfunctioning, cameras shutting down and recorders producing only static. The voices turned angry, accusatory. Why did you come here if you cannot help us? Why do you tease us with hope and then abandon us like all the others? I realized that my presence was causing them pain. These tortured souls had been reaching out for decades, hoping for rescue that never came. And now I was just another false promise, another disappointment in their endless cycle of abandonment. I tried to leave the basement, but the doors that had slammed shut would not open. The handles turned freely, but some invisible force held them closed from the other side. I was trapped in the same place where thousands of innocent people had been imprisoned and abused. The voices surrounded me now, coming from every direction at once. Not just the patients, but their tormentors as well. The cruel staff members who had beaten and neglected these vulnerable souls, somehow also bound to this place by the magnitude of their crimes. I could hear the sounds of abuse playing out in real time. The crack of leather straps against flesh, the scrape of metal restraints, the sobbing of broken minds pushed beyond their limits. The past and present had collapsed into a single moment of eternal suffering. My flashlight began to dim, and in the failing light I could see them. Translucent figures moving through the corridors, replaying their final moments in an endless loop of torment. Patients huddled in corners, staff members wielding instruments of punishment, administrators turning blind eyes to the suffering under their watch. They were all trapped here together, victims and perpetrators bound by the terrible history they had shared. The building had become a prison for the dead, holding them accountable for the roles they had played in this human tragedy. But among the crowd of spirits, I recognized the small figure of a boy crouched in the corner where the restraint rings had been mounted. Billy Kay, still 12 years old, still hoping someone would take him home. I approached the child, his spirit slowly, fighting against the supernatural forces that seemed determined to keep me away from him. As I drew closer, His translucent form became more solid, more real, until I could see the pain and hope warring in his young face. He reached out to me with a gesture that broke my heart. The simple, trusting movement of a child asking for help from an adult. I extended my own hand, and for a brief moment our fingers touched across the barrier between life and death. In that instant of contact, I experienced Billy's entire story. Committed to Pennhurst at age 8 for developmental delays that would barely qualify as disabilities today. Subjected to experimental treatments, physical abuse, and systematic dehumanization that transformed a gentle child into a broken shell of humanity. He had spent 4 years in this basement room, chained to the wall for days at a time, forgotten by staff and family alike. His death had come not from violence but from simple neglect, malnutrition, untreated illness, and a broken heart that finally stopped beating in this cold, dark place. But Billy's spirit had not moved on. He remained here, waiting for someone to acknowledge his suffering and tell the world what had been done to him. He wanted his story heard, his life validated, his humanity recognized after decades of being treated as less than human. I promised him that I would tell his story, that the world would know about Billy Kay and the thousands of other victims who had suffered in this place, that their voices would finally be heard by people who cared about their pain. The moment I made that promise, the supernatural grip on the building began to loosen. Doors swung open, my equipment started functioning normally, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. The spirits of Pennhurst were not evil. They were just desperate to be remembered. I spent the rest of the night documenting everything I could about the basement level of the Mayflower building. Room after room revealed evidence of the abuse and neglect that had characterized life at Pennhurst. Medical records left behind, restraint devices still attached to walls, personal belongings of patients who had died forgotten and alone. But most importantly, I recorded hours of audio that captured the voices of the dead. Clear, distinct pleas for help, words of love for families they would never see again, and testimonies of the cruelty they had endured. The building itself had become an archive of human suffering, preserving their stories long after their bodies had been buried in unmarked graves. As dawn approached, the supernatural activity gradually subsided. The voices faded to whispers, then to silence. The spirits of Pennhurst had delivered their message to someone who would listen, and they could finally rest. I left the asylum that morning with gigabytes of audio and video evidence, but more importantly, I carried the responsibility of sharing their stories with the world. These were not just ghost stories or paranormal phenomena. They were the testimonies of real people who had lived and suffered and died in one of America's most shameful institutions. The investigation at Pennhurst changed my approach to paranormal research forever. I realized that these locations are not just entertainment or curiosity. They are monuments to human suffering, archives of injustice that demand our attention and respect. Billy Kay and the other victims of Pennhurst deserve to have their stories told. They deserve to be remembered not as objects of pity or fear, but as human beings who had been failed by the systems designed to protect them. The screams that echo through the abandoned buildings of Pennhurst are not random paranormal events. They are the voices of the forgotten, still calling out across the decades, still hoping that someone will finally listen to their pain and remember their humanity. I have returned to Pennhurst several times since that first investigation, and each visit reveals new layers of tragedy hidden within those crumbling walls. The building continues to preserve the stories of its former residents, waiting for investigators brave enough to hear their testimonies. Because that is what ghost hunting should really be about. Not seeking thrills or collecting evidence of the supernatural, but giving voice to those who have been silenced by death. The dead of Pennhurst are not trying to scare us. They are trying to educate us about the consequences of indifference and cruelty. Their screams are not just echoes of past torment. They are warnings about what happens when we forget the humanity of the most vulnerable among us. And as long as those voices continue to cry out from the abandoned corridors of Pennhurst, we have an obligation to listen and remember.